When starting out in prepping, it's easy to get overwhelmed when trying to determine what to prepare for and how to do it. Sure, 3 weeks of food is 3 weeks of food, and it will get you through any disaster that lasts that duration of time. But fine-tuning our preps according to the real threats we face in our location can make us holistically better prepared. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a risk assessment matrix so that you can really dial in your prepping efforts and get the most out of your preps after a disaster strikes. If you're new to this channel, my name is Chris, and on this channel we discuss emergency preparedness, aka prepping. For this video, it's a little different. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to take you through a tool that I created for this community, and it's a risk assessment tool that will allow you to determine what are the most likely scenarios that you need to prepare for. By doing this, by really going through and thinking it through all the way, it will really help you, I believe, make you all the more proficient in your preparedness. So what we've done is we've created this risk assessment matrix. It's a free download that you can pick up online. It's a spreadsheet. I'm going to walk you through in this video. And the cool thing about this tool is that you can actually edit it. We set up different calculations in it so that you can put in values, and we'll talk about these in a moment, how we derive these values. And at the end, what it does is it outputs information in a column. And so what it allows you to do is go through and assess what are the most likely scenarios that you'll face. And again, hopefully it will help you to determine you should prepare for that as opposed to just random things. When people get into preparedness, it's easy to start going after, well, I heard this is a threat or this is a threat, and people start chasing the wrong things. So by pulling us back to a tool that allows us to logically walk through what is the most likely scenario, it will allow you to prepare very, very proficiently. I'll put it that way. So again, I'll put a link below, and if you want to check it out on my website, you can go to cityprepping.com/risk, R-I-S-K. That's cityprepping.com/risk. So what I'll do is let's turn over this document. I'm going to show you my desktop. And I know this may be hard to see if you're on a mobile device, and I'll zoom in a second. But essentially, we've got several different columns here. And as you see, let me scroll over, you can see that we've got a lot of different categories. And on the far right, we've got number values, and we'll talk about this in a moment. Now, on the left, I've got different types of threats that we'll likely face. And what we try to do is we try to go through pretty much any potential situation, whether that's natural, geological, infrastructure, societal, large scale such as EMP, solar flares, personal disasters. And what we did is we left 3 rows at the bottom of this first column that if there's something in particular you want to prepare for that we didn't cover, well, you can just plug those plug that information there, and you're going to be able to go through these steps that we're going to talk about here, and it will help you determine what is the most likely thing that you should prepare for. All right, so let's look back at the desktop here. Now, it may be kind of hard to see, especially if you're on a mobile device. So what I'll do is let me zoom in to 150%. All right. So what you see on this right here, you'll see these are broken up into different colors. You'll see this one, for example, this group is historical probability. This one is duration. How long do you expect that event to last? We'll talk about scope. You know, is it local? Is it 25 miles out? Is it 50 miles out? Threats to your preps. Will this impact your water, your food, your shelter, your security, your medical? This next one is personal impact. Will it impact you, your family, your friends, your dependents, other strangers? And then we get into things like systems impact. Will it mess up communications, utilities, EMS? And then these last 3 are climate, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Damage, is this something you can fix? You have to get the insurance company involved. And then last, proximity. Is it going to impact you directly while you're away from home, while you're somewhere near you, or somewhere else? And at the very right, you can see that we've got the numbers added up here. And what we did was we fill out about 4 of these different rows to kind of give you an example. And for this first one, I'll talk about wildfire. Where I live, we are constantly under the threat of wildfire. I just got a phone call yesterday from my insurance carrier that our home insurance policy is going to go up 50% because fires are such a massive problem where we're at. So as you can imagine, they're probably using something very, very similar to this. They're probably not too concerned about a flash flood or a sandstorm where I'm at, but they are very concerned about fires. So for them and their own internal matrix system, they probably have something very, very similar to what I'm about to show you. All right, so let's go back to our desktop here. Now, the first one is historical probability. What we do is we look at this one. If we were to say, all right, current threat, wildfires. At the time I'm recording this video, we just more or less entered into our rain season. I'm at the middle of January. Fire season ended roughly around middle of December. So we're more or less, all right, I'm not too worried about fires right now. Everything's pretty much wet outside. But in the last, as you can see here, now we start looking at these by time frames. This one's 100 to 200. Yeah, there's been fires in the last 100 to 200. There's been in the last 50, 20, 10, and 5. And so for each of one of these, I can put in 5, 5 being the highest probability that it's going to happen here. And what we did is we put notes in each one of these columns. So for example, let's look at this one. This is a 5 if the event has occurred in your area in the last 5 years. It is a 0 if the event has never occurred in your area during that time span. So again, if you're not sure, just read what we put in here. This is a guide to kind of help walk you through it. The next one is duration. How long will this probably impact you? I lived in San Diego years ago, and in 2004, we had massive fires that went through the area there. And I believe it lasted nearly a couple of weeks. It just seemed like it wouldn't end. It went past the 72-hour mark. It went on and on and on. So getting back to our example here, yeah, it's not unlikely that we could see a week, 2 weeks of fires raging out of control. And typically when we have a really bad fire season in California, it can go for quite a long time, if not for months, depending on where it's at. Now, these other ones, scope, and again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but as you can see, it just walks you through. Is this going to impact you, in your personal area? Is this 50 miles out, 100 miles national? So as you go through each one of these, this one talks about threat to your preps. Will it impact your water? Let's look at this one. Assess from 1 to 5, with a 1 being your stored water supplies, will get you through to a 5 being the need to find water in the wild and render it drinkable. So if there's a wildfire, as long as it doesn't burn down my house, I'll be fine because I have water stored. So that one's a low one for me. That's a 1. I'm not going to have to go out because of fire and look for water. Now, if power goes down, our pumps stop working on the water, again, if I've got water stored, I'll be fine. If you don't, then yeah, you're going to put a 5 there because you didn't have water stored. Same with food. If this requires you to track down food, go out and forage, then you're in a 5 situation. So as you can see, just read the notes and it will tell you how to rate that. Personal impact, you, pod being your friends or family, dependents, your children, others, strangers. So what impact will it have on them? Systems impact, and to me this is really important because if we have fires that sweep through, it could burn down power lines, it could burn down or it could impact different substations where they have communications that run through it. So as you can see, this goes on and it impacts these different systems, and you would rate what you would consider a potential threat. Now climate, this one says just 5 points if your climate is relatively nice year round. Maybe there are a few days of rain, cold. So if you're not too worried about it being really bad weather, it's always temperate, you would rate it accordingly. Now, as you go on, the damage, is this something you can fix? Insurance needs to fix? State or federal funding is going to need to get involved, or is it just absolutely beyond repair? And then this one gets into proximity. Is it going to directly impact you? Is it going to impact you while potentially being away from home? If you work and you have to commute, I work from home, I don't have to commute, so I'm fortunate. If this event could occur near you but is not likely in your area, again, give it from a 1 to 5. So you see where I'm going with this. Hopefully this, again, this quick walkthrough explains how to use it. Let me back out here to 100%. All right. So again, I would encourage you to go over each one of these categories here, these different threats. Hailstorms, this one, let me just zoom in real quick, is the least of my concerns. I'm not saying it's impossible. I can't think of a time in historical precedent where I live that we've had hailstorms being an issue. Now, I grew up in Texas, and I remember cars driving around all the time that looked like, someone taking a shotgun to them. They were just, the top of the car was riddled with, these potholes, these small holes all over the hood, the top of the cars, because hailstorms were a big problem out there, and the insurance carriers had to adjust accordingly for that possibility. Out here, not so much. So you can go through each one of these, and again, we break them up by different categories. So hopefully this will give you an idea of how to use this tool. Now let me flip over to 3 other things here that I did just kind of throw in some extras here for you. We originally didn't put these in, but I decided to toss them in anyway. This tab right down here says water. So the rule of thumb for preppers is to have, at a minimum, 1 gallon of water per person per day. I usually try to go with 2 gallons per person per day just because 1 is incredibly minimal. 2 is a lot better of a situation because things like cooking, sanitation, etc. How many days do you want to prepare for? If you want to prepare for 30 days of a disaster and you've got 5 people in your family, then that means you need 300 gallons. So if you adjust this, if you were to say, no, I've only got 2 people in my family, then it updates for you accordingly. Okay, let's look at the next one, which is food. Same thing. If we were to say a minimum amount of calories that you want per day is 2,000. Again, that's just barely scraping by. That's not even assuming you getting out and really exerting yourself, but 2,000 is kind of a starting point. We would say, again, 2,000. So again, if you want to say, well, I'm really more comfortable with 24, well, you bump that up. You do your thing, right? So this is how many days you're preparing for and how many people. So if it's just you and a spouse and no one else, well, that's how many calories, and you can work backwards from there when you begin to prepare to store your food. The next one is energy. It gets a little more complicated. Let me explain this to you. In a separate video I did, and I linked to it right here. You can go to this video. I go through and I explain how to size your power needs. It's not that difficult. You can determine how many watts you need. And it's not too hard to go backwards and determine how many watts you need a day. If you were to say, I need 200 watts a minimum per hour, which is not much, then I need 2,400 watts. So again, put the number that you calculate in a day and how many days you need that. So if you were to say, I need 200 watts per hour for 30 days, then that gives you a total right here. Now this is useful when we start looking at different ways of harvesting, or rather producing power rather. Now I've got a couple of solar generators sitting behind me, one over here and one over here. I've got several on the other side of me that I'll be reviewing here shortly. And these are usually rated by how many watts they can pull in off solar panels in a given hour. So for example, the one over here can take in 400 watts per hour. So if I were to buy one of these and I'm like, okay, I can hook up 400 watts of solar panels and I've got roughly 10 hours a day of good sunlight that I can charge, that means I'm going to be able to produce 4,000 watts that are going to be available to me during the day. All right. Now, if you have a generator, on the other hand, something like a gas generator, propane, diesel, this gives you running capacity, how much it will operate. If when you go to buy a generator, you'll see 2 numbers, and this is the same on typically on what's called a solar generator. You'll see running and surge. Running is how much it will operate when you start it up. Surge is when you plug in a device that needs that extra kick to get it going, something like a refrigerator that has a motor that has to spin up in order to operate. And so whether you buy a gas or solar generator, they'll have those 2 ratings. All right, so once you determine that generator's capacity to run, and it can say running watts is at 3,500, well, guess what? You really need to cut that number in half. What they do is they're really telling you how much maximum it can run at in a given hour. But like a car, you don't take a car out and it redlines at, let's say, 7,000 RPM. You're not going to ride, or rather drive that at 7,000 RPM everywhere you go. If you do that for long enough, you're going to blow the engine. Same with the gas generators, and the solar generators are similar. They'll overheat. So what you typically have to do is operate at around 50% of what it says. So if it's telling you can operate at 3,500, you really need to come in and again, I put this 0.5. You can change that number if you want, but again, think about what I explained earlier. So our generator hourly output, if we're at 50% capacity, is 1,750 watts. Now, the running time. How do we determine running time? I have a Champion, I think 3750 dual fuel generator sitting in the garage. And on their website, and I just took a little snapshot here to kind of give you an example. On their website, they say this. It has 3,500 running watts, and it will run for 9 hours at 50% load with a 3.4 gallon tank. So it tells me up front, this generator at 50% load will run for 9 hours on 3.4 gallons. So they tell me all the information. So I had 3,500. Let's change that to 34 because they said 34. All right. So we see now what it can generate per hour in wattage is 1,700. The running time is 9 hours. And the total outputage in watts for those 9 hours is roughly this number, 15,300 watts, and that's with 3.4 gallons of fuel. For my device, I have a 3.4 gallon tank. So what I can quickly see is that I can produce 4,500 watts per gallon, 4,500 watts per gallon. So that tells me my efficiency more or less on this device. If this confuses you, the spreadsheet, don't worry. For those that have generators, this hopefully will be a useful tool. Okay, so having gone over all the threat matrix, I've given you some additional tools that you can use for determining your water, your food, and your energy needs. So based on your results, here are the things that we really need to think through. We need to think about our water, our food, our energy, our shelter, our security, our medical, and our mobility. Each one of these will be directly impacted by what our threat assessment matrix tells us. So let me run you through this really quick. The first one comes down to water. And we just went through that tab a second ago. We calculated how we determine how much water we need. Now, if your water is threatened in the risk matrix, if it determines that because of the threat, you need to have water stored on hand, that you're not going to be able to go out into the wild or whatever, because there's been an event that's occurred and you're not going to be able to go to rivers or streams, calculate that and think it through. Because if you determine, well, shoot, if something happens, it's really up to me. Well, what that means is you're going to need to store more water. And again, using that calculator, you'll be able to determine how much water you need to store. All right, the same thing with the food. We went through that food tab, and what we're able to do is determine how much food we need based on calories that we assume that we're going to consume on a day. And I ran through the numbers. Again, we used 2,000 calories because if you go under 2,000 calories for the typical American, you're going to begin to start losing weight. If you anticipate that you're going to be active, which probably most people will, you're going to want to bump that up closer to 2,500 or maybe even 3,000 calories. Now for children, a 1-year-old is about 900 calories of usage, 2 to 3-year-olds about 1,000, 4 to 8-year-olds about 1,200. So I always just round it up to 2,000 calories per person, and it just gives me a good number because if you got food stored away, well, those children are going to age over time, and we just want to make sure we always have enough for an adult at minimum. All right, now beyond this, when we talk about food, obviously you're going to need a variety of nutritionally dense food that provide proteins, carbohydrates, sugars, and fats. And if your food sources are mostly vulnerable in one of the risk matrix scenarios, you will eventually probably want to learn how to forage. So you're going to know where food sources are around you, or store more variety of food specifically packed for disasters and a long-term shelf life. So again, when you look at your food, think it through. Will the risk impact your food? If so, then you need to know how to forage. If you're not going to be able to hold on to the food that you have. But for me personally, my plan is always let's go with our food first. I don't want to be in a situation where I've got to forage. All right, now the next one is shelter. If your shelter is highly threatened by any of the scenarios, focus on this first. As a prepper, shelter is everything. If you're exposed to the elements, you could die quickly depending on the situation. Food and water are secondary to shelter. So make sure that if you're concerned that your shelter could be a victim of whatever the disaster is, I live in earthquake territory. And I know very well that if we have a massive enough earthquake, it could damage our house and make it or we just can't live here. So having a tarp, a rain flyer tent for us, these are things that we have in different bags in our garage, etc. Now, as far as energy, as I mentioned a second ago in that tab, when I pulled that tab open, I referenced a video that I'd done before, and I'll post a link in the cards and description if you want to check that out. And it helps you go through and calculate how much power you need after a disaster, because it's kind of odd and obscure when you look at generator sizes, and that video goes into a lot of detail to break it down to help you scale how much power you anticipate you'll need, and then go after the right device to match that need. Now, when we talk about security is really a broad subject, and we really have to narrow it down to assess which is threatened more. When we talk about threats from different disasters or whatever it is, we have to look at the threat in our location, and we have to look at the threat to our person. Now the threat, let me explain this. A threat in our location, let's use a tornado as an example. If you live in tornado prone areas, but you have an underground shelter, your house is more threatened than you are personally, because if you have that means to go underground and a tornado sweeps over and destroys your house, hopefully if you have the shelter, you'll be fine. So your house in that situation is more threatened than you are. But if you were to live in an area like this and you don't have a storm shelter, well, then you are more likely to be threatened than both your house and your person. But again, I'll use another example. If you were to live in a population dense area and there was a total societal collapse In that situation, both the home and the person have a high threat probability. So there's not really an escape plan unless you can either bug out or you've got some kind of a bunker you can retreat to. In that case, you really have to think through a mobility plan. And again, understand the difference with each disaster that scores high on your matrix. Do the homework, sit down and think it through, that if a disaster sweeps through, you have a plan for both your home and your person. Now, when we talk about medical, what I always encourage people to do is anticipate a few different things. Anticipate your ongoing health needs, your daily needs, and long-term loss of medical services. Let's talk about each one of those. For ongoing needs medically, if you're diabetic, that's a risk, or rather a high-risk condition that you absolutely have to plan for, because you know that's not something that even if a disaster sweeps through, that you're just going to be able to, not take care of that situation. So for you, having a means to produce, or rather keep your medicine cold, maybe the energy production, whether that's a gas generator or solar, you need to really think that through. Now, as far as daily needs, when it comes to medical, anticipating cuts, bruises, diarrhea, fever, sprains, broken bones, heat strokes, frostbite, and everything in between from minor to the extreme. Calculate that and think that through depending on your area. Where I live, I don't live in an area, it's a very temperate climate. We don't really have a lot of extremes. It can get down to freezing, but rarely. Whereas if you were to live in Canada or Michigan, being in a snowstorm is a real possibility. Now, as far as long-term medical needs, this is where you really have to think these situations through, that you might have to perform certain medical procedures. There's books out there on providing insight into dental practices for third world developing nations. I'll put a link to one of those books that I would recommend below. There's books on, medical situations. The book I always recommend, I've got it down here, I won't reach for it, but it's Dr. Bones and Nurse Amy. They have the 4th edition, their medical survival handbook that I always recommend preppers pick up when they first get into preparedness. And so having the ability to handle these different medical conditions, think it through, because in a long-term collapse, these are things that you might have to deal with or take care of yourself. Now, when we talk about mobility, my first choice is always the shelter in place. I did a video on this last week when I talked about, or rather a poll asking people what would force them out. Most people responded, nothing's going to force me out. But we saw just recently the events in Colorado where people were forced out. They had no choice. A fire swept through and they had to move out quickly or they wouldn't have survived. And some of those people may have been preppers. Hopefully they had a 72-hour bag. Hopefully they had a strategy to bug out and to get out quickly. And I hope that all the people there did fine as a result. So do you have a bug out location? If not, I've got a video where I discuss different alternatives if you don't have a bug out location. Is there a chance that a disaster could prevent you from getting home if you work at a job that's far away from your home? So when we talk about mobility, it encompasses a lot of things. We have to talk about location options, where we can go, proximal location areas to your home base, different areas in your surrounding area that you can access quickly, different mobile assets such as caches that you have stored in your route, bikes or vehicles to get you there, and your level of fitness. A lot of people assume that if something happens, they're just going to be able to walk or run or get on a bike, and it really comes down to your level of physical fitness. So I know I threw a lot at you, but again, hopefully this risk matrix gave you enough insight to get you thinking about these different categories that I ran through. But again, this is how I approach prepping personally. I always sit down and evaluate. For me, fire is a big issue, earthquakes is a big issue, and we don't have a lot of water where I'm at. So I base a lot of my preps around those threats and how I will react. So in conclusion, I would recommend you do this risk assessment matrix. Sit down, take the time. Again, I'll provide a link. You can run it on put it on your computer, go through, type in the different values, and then look up the categories and determine what you scored highest on and begin to prepare for that. Look, prepping is a generalized goal. I realize that. Food is food, water is water, medical supplies are medical supplies. But you can really maximize your efforts by fine-tuning what your specific threats are and going after that. Hopefully this video gave you a lot to think about. Again, I know I threw a lot at you, but hopefully it's a useful starting point when you really begin to assess what is most important. As always, please stay safe out there.